Part of what makes going to a StarCraft 2 tournament fun is you get to meet the people that you've been watching stream and play for years. Oftentimes these are players who you've watched their personal stream of with commentary and sort of know their personality, know how they like to play. And for a lot of the other players, they seem like demigods who you only see occasionally on GSL. They don't stream, not even on Afrika, and they almost never play non-Koreans. This is my favorite LAN ever and what I consider to be the best LAN in StarCraft 2 history. This is MLG Dallas 2013. What makes this LAN special is this was the first LAN where all of the S-class, god-tier, top-end name guys from Brood War, I'm talking Flash, Jaedong, Bisu, Rain, the legends, the biggest hitters ever. If you were to have a Hall of Fame, then these would be the guys that would get in the first ballot. These guys were not allowed to switch over to StarCraft 2 when it came out in 2010. They had to keep playing Brood War so they could continue to support the Brood War Pro League. Remember, Brood War Pro League was immensely popular in Korea, and they would consistently draw a plethora of viewers on television, so Kespa didn't want to kill the golden goose, so to speak. And no one was going to watch Brood War Pro League if the 70 best players all left. So at the beginning of Wings of Liberty, you saw a lot of the low-end A-teamers like MVP and like 2v2 players like Nesty and guys who could never break through like MC. These were the guys who were really the heavy hitters at the beginning of Wings of Liberty, who sort of found their niche in a new game. And people would always say in Wings of Liberty, especially the old school Brood War cats, they would say, man, like, yeah, that rush looked good or that muta micro looked good, but I wonder how Jaedong would handle it. I wonder how Flash would stop that cheese. Even throughout wildly successful Wings of Liberty, especially at the beginning whenever people were really trying to figure stuff out, there was always this sort of tongue-in-cheek thing of like, oh, well, can you imagine like once Flash switches over, he's going to destroy us all. I remember Tempo even made a joke about that in one of his songs. Shout out to the homie Tempo, who's incredibly talented. Tempo is one of those cats who you would see at this LAN. I literally met Tempo at this LAN. Funnily enough, Tempo is one of the most famous people from the StarCraft 2 scene that I've played. We played a ZVZ on Neo Planet S, which was sort of a cheesy rush map that was in the pool at this time. And Tempo 10 pooled and I hatched first and barely held and then like won in a macro game. But anyway, like one thing about going to these tournaments is not only are you able to meet and talk to these people that you've been watching the streams of and following the careers of for years, but you also meet other people that are fans of the scene that you sort of know adjacently or are aware of. And that's not even including your own personal internet friends that you've, talked to on BattleNet, and you're like, they also going to the LAN. So if you think about going to one of these LANs, you're walking around and like, oh, there's StarTail Life right there, one of the best Zerg players ever. Regardless of how he was disgraced later in his career, what you need to know about StarTail Life is this. This was a truly special Zerg player. He was the best Zerg player at the end of Wings of Liberty. He was the best Zerg player at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm. He redefined the Zerg versus Terran meta, and when it came to controlling Zerglings, that's his signature maneuver. And I know for a lot of you that might sound absurd. Like, what do you mean controlling Zerglings? Like, you just like run around and surround an A move. Like, what? That's absurd. What do you mean control Zerglings? No, like StarTrail Life was truly special. Whenever we look at metagames in StarCraft 2 history, specifically Zerg vs Terran, at the beginning of games releases, Terran dominates, okay? And a lot of that is because if we just think about the basic mechanics of the game, Zerg is the defending race, right? Well, that means that the more new stuff there is, the more that it favors Terran. The longer the game goes on and the bigger the maps get, the better Zerg gets. You wonder why Zerg is so consistent and good now? They've had 15 years to figure everything out. The game's insanely stale and all the maps are really big. I saw a couple of the maps they use in this tournament, like at least they're trying something new, like the sort of scrap station-esque ice map, but You had real legitimate map pools back in this era. Neoplanet S was a bad for Zerg, pain in the ass map. Whirlwind, which is what we see now, was a map that if you spawned in close was decent for Terran, but if you spawned in cross, it was a pure macro map. If we note one thing about StarTale Life, this is a player that would love to go mutiling Baneling and basically made a career off of it, and was a guy who at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm showed that that was the only way to play. That means he likes to skip roaches. Ravagers did not exist in Heart of the Swarm. Remember, this is MLG Dallas 2013. All the best Koreans have just come over. StarTale Life has skipped roaches. He has no lings. He has 21 lings to 17 Hellions. He's dead as a doornail. I was standing behind him. I saw these Hellions show up. I thought he's dead. There's no way anyone will hold this. He has no units right now. Look at all these Hellions. There's like 15 Hellions in his natural, incinerating the drones. And Life is trying to defend with queens. He's moving the drones around, and he's maneuvering the lings around to try to trap the Hellions and not take excessive splash. Morphing two banelings at the base of his ramp, trying to get us around. And note, whenever he gets trapped into the corridor, he dives that corner one as he pulls away his drones. Another ling is going to come up as the Hellions blast away, and note Life moving his drones in and out to try to bait the shots over back into the queen. If he had just run his drones away, the Hellions would have simply circled around and blasted them around the ramp. And also note, if you've been diligently watching a minimap, Life has been counterattacking. It was counterattacking Zergling heavy styles and understanding ZVT that really made Life special. There's Last right there. If you don't know, Last was a very solid player in StarCraft 2. But whenever all the Kespa cats switched over, it was sort of like there wasn't enough tournament and spots for them to truly succeed. If you know what I mean, like there might have been 100 Gosu players, well there's only like so many tournaments out in Korea. So whenever they came over to the West to be able to participate in MLGs, is look at this 6 surround by Life, as again, Blue Flame Hellions did more damage than you think. And whenever we think about StarCraft 2 history, they did exceptionally more whenever Wings of Liberty came out, and the Slayers Terrans at MLG Anaheim 2011 did this build called the Elevator build, where they would open Blue Flame Hellion and get a medevac and like medevac the Hellions into your main, and that got Blue Flame nerfed. That was an interesting little example of how certain teams will come together and practice and develop a style and a build together. The Slayers Terrans did that. And that was one thing that we saw a lot more in Brood War than we did in StarCraft 2. In StarCraft 2, there was more of a focus on training on the ladder and not really playing in-house custom so much. We can see Life begrudgingly going roaches here, getting roach speed and getting roach attack upgrades, even though it was essentially impossible to defend a pure Blue Flame Hellion push with pure lings. Life managed to do it. And one thing that I want to note there is that's not like a game we would see now where the Zerg would just defend with like 6 or 7 forward queens. No, like Life defended almost entirely with lings and did it with micro, okay? And I remember watching this game and being like, holy shit, like whenever he defended that in the subsequent attack, because I was watching from Life's POV, it was just like, you know that moment in StarCraft where your opponent moves out with a crap load and you've been making only workers and you're like, oh, I'm dead. Like, if he just A-moves me, I lose. Last did a build that explicitly countered Life's style. He went pure Blue Flame Hellion, a Ling Buster build. And what did Life do? He arrogantly stayed on pure Ling. He even delayed Baneling Nest and didn't make that many queens. One thing that you've got to understand about Life is that he's a very arrogant player in person, okay? And we're not going to go into the entire scandal. If you want to hear about his scandal, I casted another series from this tournament, Life versus Flash. I did the whole best of 7, and for that video, I take a very nuanced look at the match-fixing scandal Life was later embroiled in. But the good does not wash out the bad. These are truly brilliant games, and whenever Life was in this era, this end of Wings of Liberty, beginning of Heart of the Swarm era, he was the Zerg player that everybody else, all the other Zerg players looked to figure out how to counter certain things. So it's terribly ostentatious to just pretend he doesn't exist, which is, by the way, literally what Blizzard told like all the BlizzCon casters to do in perpetuity, not just at BlizzCon. Yeah, just don't mention life. Like pretend he doesn't exist. And if you sort of pause the video and think like, when was the last time I was watching like a major tournament and like they actually mentioned life? And if somehow life was mentioned, did they say his name or was he referred to in a colloquialism like the forbidden one or something, like. And that's one thing about this channel is like we take a look back at the history of StarCraft and we're honest. And at this time, life was a god. Holding off that Blue Flame Hellion attack with only Lings was unfathomable. He essentially did it twice. And if you think about him as a person, he was sort of like an arrogant, flippant person. I remember Naniwa would tell a funny story. Naniwa in life, by the way, played in a big finals, IEM New York. This was Nani at the peak of his powers. This was probably a year after these matches. And hilariously, Naniwa would lose the series, but that wasn't the hilarious part. The hilarious part was Life, whenever he was ahead in the games, would fucking manor hatch Naniwa. Like he would build hatches in Nani's base as a fuck you get out move. Which is so bad manner, especially for a Korean pro gamer. If we think about the sort of style these Korean players interview in, it's very respectful. Thank you to my fans. Thank you for the games. I'll try my best to win. And they're almost sort of laughed at and panned in many ways for being like too boring. And if we think about players like MC or Parting, who by the way were both exceptionally talented at this time, part of why people like those players so much and why those two guys are adored is because they'll speak English and talk shit and they're confident. So Life didn't really speak much English. I met him, like I can confirm, like he didn't really speak much English at all. But this was a guy who would manner hatch his opponents and like do like sort of like funny bad manner moves. And if we look at that series I did where I did all of Innovation's GSL games, Life would famously play Innovation in a best of three, and the deciding game was on this map, and freaking Innovation manner muled him. Which again, like a manner hatch is a big diss move, although a manner mule is way more common, as we see a beautiful drop from Last here. Last, of course, an exceptionally talented multi-time ASL champion. That's what was so crazy about this era, was you had guys like Flash and Jaedong and Bisu coming over, but then there were also the guys just a tick below them that were like the second, third, and fourth best in the race that were also, and it's like, well, how did they compare to like all the foreigners and all the other Koreans? Like they were probably still second, third, or fourth best in the race, because we're talking about guys like Last, who, if you're thinking like, well, like why haven't I heard of Last? Because he had to run into other buzzsaws. Like he was playing the best of the best. He was playing the old Wings of Liberty GSL guys. He was playing every single top end Korean that switched over. Virtually none of them stayed in Brood War after HOTS. And then all the best foreigners too, whenever they went to tournaments like this. So Last was very good. Like we saw him switch back to Brood War and win multiple ASLs. And one thing is, as we see Life try to counterattack, there are players like Last or Sky High or names like this where you might not really know, but they were incredibly good and they were capable of winning tournaments like this. And whenever you consider the fact that a lot of these guys sort of just slipped through the cracks in this Heart of the Swarm era, a lot of these games are very exciting and worth revisiting because the meta is also very good too, especially Zerg versus Terran. Life, even though he arrogantly opened and defended with Lings, was in a position where the Terrans still got a great economy going. He wasn't able to really do any counterattack harass. And now he's just trying to bleed the army with Swarm Hosts. Last has pulled SCVs to do auto repair. The Hellbats are going to splash the Locust down. And Life really doesn't have a chance here. Another thing Life was good at was a lot of guys would like spam spellcasters or over rely on them all in one hotkey. Life would just make a couple if he was in like a pinch or a close game or a base trading game. He was good at like making just a couple infestors and trying to get use out of them, although we can see they're low on energy here. Part of what made going to these events exciting is If we think about the names that were at this event, like it was literally all the best Koreans and all the best foreigners, and you were in a position where you could walk up and talk to them and ask them questions. It was absolutely amazing. If we think about the casters that were here too, it was incredible. Let me just read you a little bit about this. This is the event we're watching now, the 2013 MLG Dallas. Life and Minigun played in the first round. Now, Life obviously smoked Minigun's boots, but you got to see like an American guy that people like that streamed a lot take on the best Korean in the world. And I remember Minigun he had this like, I've actually asked Minigun about this on his stream and we've sort of laughed about it. And he goes, yeah, I didn't have a chance because all my builds against NA players were like go fast 3 Nexus. And then Life was just like cheesing the shit out of Minigun. And he 3-0'd Minigun in like 15 minutes and it was just Life cheesing. That was another thing that made Life special, was his ability to go for early pool play and aggressive play and mix cheese into his play. Look at the hatch barely survived there. Because if we consider, and obviously this game's over with last about 120 supply, but if we just consider the difference in the scenes here, okay, I'll just go through the list of like the big first round. Polt versus Creator, Stefano versus Last, Thorzane versus Killer as Last takes the victory there. And again, these guys are in the pit, so you can stand up behind them and watch this. There are like 20 other dope games going on in the pit beside them, and there's a big game on the main stage. So whenever you consider like the plethora of options that you have, it puts you in a position where you have so many choices. You have the ability to seek out something that's truly great. And speaking of truly great, look at the casters, bro. Day 9 and In Control. So let's just reflect upon MLG a little bit more. Feast versus MVP, Tasia versus Sauce, Ghost User versus Bomber, Bly versus Flash, Suppy versus Rhett, Sin versus Vibe. Think about like these matchups. Even the mirror matches are like exceptionally talented American versus exceptionally talented foreigner. Like Suppy versus Rhett, I'd watch that all day long. Like I love both those guys. That was one thing that I noticed about like I would say the first 5 years of StarCraft, or at least like the first 2 years of Wings and the first 2 years of HOTS, is that there were a lot of these mirrors that you would look forward to. And there was something, and a lot of the mirror matchups in terms of meta sucked. But if we just think about it in terms of like, okay, well, freaking MC's playing Hero, and MC's like the reigning best toss, and Hero's like the best up and coming Kespa. Like it was so much greatness and interesting stuff. And if we consider other matchups, Marine King, who of course foreigner fans love, versus Jockshi, okay? We'll go ahead and flip it to game 5 here. But here's what I find interesting is like this is merely the first round. And this isn't even like the open bracket or whatever. So again, Seed versus Rain. Seed was a guy who like stole the GSL finals from MC. Artosis put it, MC choked in his, or I guess it might have been DRG. Okay, here's what it was. It was MC and DRG, and basically DRG choked the semifinals. So then it was a PvP finals that MC like goofily lost. If you look at the history of GSL champions, especially imagining them in like a banner format, a lot of the names would seem weird, you know, like names like Inno would be normal, right? Names like MVP and Nest-T would be normal. But then like you see names like Jockji and Sniper, and you're like, I've never even fucking heard of those guys. Jockji was a Terran player that won a GSL in the GOM TVT era, where Terran was very good. Okay, so it was sort of cool to see a guy like Jockji, who, of course, GSL winner, regardless of winner, meta, GSL winner is a huge deal, play a fan favorite like MKP. And again, these are in the first round. I'm just going down the list. I'm not cherry picking. State, the American Protoss player versus Parting. Okay. I mean, what do I even need to say about that? Parting is like one of the most beloved, talented Korean players out there. To see him play a North American player in the first round would be compelling because, you know, it's the NA player and there's the underdog factor. So Seed and Rain, even though Seed stole that GSL from MC, Rain, who was in my opinion the best toss ever, swept him. And then here's one that was on the main stage that I remember watching, Huck and Inno. This was Inno at the absolute peak of his powers as Life Scouts the Proxy Racks. That's funny. And what's absolutely amazing about Inno was that, like, not only was he a guy that was very good in Korea, but he performed outside of Korea too. And in this series, like, he absolutely demolished Huck. And, like, I love Huck and was cheering for him so hard. And, like, this was back before, this was, let me put this in perspective, guys. This was, like, back whenever Widow Mines were so new that whenever Inno was doing a mind strategy versus Huck, like a mind push sort of like bio build like you would do versus Terran. Inno did this and like Huck drew the mind fire and blinked out of it, and that was the first time a lot of people had ever seen that. So to put in perspective, like the Widow Mine had just come out. And I remember Huck went down 0-2 and came out of his booth for a break, and I yelled, "Huck, we believe." And then, like, he obviously lost the third game because it was fucking innovation at the peak of his powers, like one of the best and most scary peaks ever. And then Baby Knight versus Leenock. So in that first round, we have a plethora of Korean versus foreigner matchups, and even the mirrors are very exciting, okay? And into the next round, MC versus MVP. Two legends from GSL, two GSL champs. Crazy. Tasia versus Bomber. Tasia was a guy who destroyed foreigner tournaments. Bomber was a guy who did the same. Flash versus Rhett. The best pro gamer ever versus one of the best foreigners ever. Both total macro players. Jock G versus Rain. GSL champ versus future GSL champ. Inno versus Zerg. Like, you see what I'm saying about, like, these matchups were just so cool. And as you would walk around, you would get to meet and talk to these great people. Okay, if we think about the event that just occurred in Dallas, it wasn't really like this in terms of the people that you were able to see and meet. It was just not on the same level, to be completely honest with you. So this was one thing that I wanted to reflect upon, basically, was how this went in terms of StarCraft 2 history. Man, like, the game used to be so special and so cool, and we're sort of in a position where you look at the tournaments now and it's depressing. Not just who they have, but it's like how big it was. Like at MLGs, they used to have open brackets that would go 9 deep, and it would be double a limb. And now essentially what we have, and this goes for the GSL too, it's almost like they can barely get enough people to do the tournament. And whenever they announce the talent, there were of course plenty of people up there that were deserving and good, Zombie Grub and Pig. But whenever you do these big events, like, the event organizers need to hire like the absolute top end talent. So it sort of rankles, and it's weird to me whenever Dan Artosis isn't at these foreigner tournaments. Like, Dan, where is Dan at these DreamHacks? Because Dan was at a lot of these old MLGs and would do exceptional during them. So I'm asking, what the hell is going on? And I asked this to Artosis. I said, Artosis, like, I saw that you weren't on the caster list for Dallas. And he's like, no, I'm not. You're right, I wasn't on the list. And I go, well, did they offer you a spot? And he said no. Can you believe that? He said no. Like, how absurd is it that Artosis, the best StarCraft commentator out there, literally the guy who, like, is out there hard carrying the scene and, like, slept in closets in Korea because he loves the game so much, how does he not even get a fucking phone call? How are you not saying, like, hey Dan, like, you know, like, our talent budget's this, and we're gonna give half to you because you're the gold standard. We'll fly you out from Canada. We know you don't have to do GSL anymore. That was the big problem before. A lot of times, if events didn't have Artosis, if big lands didn't have Artosis, it was because there was a conflict with GSL, not because they didn't ask. I mean, can you believe, like, the absurdity in not asking Artosis? Oh, like, hey, we're gonna have one of the only lands for StarCraft this year. Maybe we should have fucking asked the best guy on the planet if he wanted to call the games. It's so ridiculous to me. And I live in Texas, and I saw, oh, IEM Dallas coming up. Well, first of all, like, I've never had so much trouble finding like info on something on Wikipedia and like on the DreamHack website or IEM, whatever. I remember like back in MLG or like IEM days, like they would at least have basic information on their website of like what games would be there. Like as you see another attempted Hellion push here from last, and Life has a Sim City and a Spine up here. It'll be way easier to defend. So he's trying to hammer away at that Spine and trying to get clearance. Obviously, what Blue Flame Hellions do bonus damage to light units. So if you can blast all the lings like that, that's good. But notice how Life is positioning his queens where it sort of impedes the progress of the Hellions. And then he only runs up with the lings long enough to sponge damage. Okay, he's stalling, he's baiting. 20 more lings in production tab, the Bane Nest almost done. And whenever Terrans did builds like this, it was like, look how much gas he has. Like there wasn't like he's making a third, but like it's not mining. Like he delayed his third to do this. So that was one thing about the meta. It wasn't just everyone gets 3 base for free. That's one galling thing about watching Legacy, and a big reason why the meta is so boring and why the game has fallen off so much in terms of viewability. Is the game is now in a position where Zerg especially is basically entitled to 3 bases. Whereas if you're a fan of this channel and you've watched a little bit of Lings and you've watched a little bit of HOTS, you know that there's actual build-up and decision making. Like we're 11 minutes in this game and we're seeing the Terran player do an attack on the Zerg that's potentially like game ending or like game swinging devastating as he clears a whole mineral line there. Think about a Legacy game now. It's 6 minutes, the Zerg is going to have enough forward queens where no matter like basically like the Terran can do any sort of cheesy rush they want, it's all going to be countered to some degree by the queen. As you see, Life's workers almost doubled. That's part of why the game is so boring to watch now. There are these huge boring macro maps. It's very safe and easy for Zerg. Zerg has had so much time to learn. As we see, Life is in severe trouble here as he's at half the workers of his opponent and gets backstabbed and loses a few more. 30 workers down for Life. But remember what I was saying, whenever Terrans would do this build, it was like, okay, all I'm going to do is make Hellions. Like they weren't making tanks behind it. So even though there are no Ravagers and Roaches, as Idra once put it, really are god-awful units, Life is actually going to go across the map and do enough counter damage to stay in the game. There is a tank on the low ground, there are a handful of Blue Flame Hellions, but ultimately Life is going to try to dive this tank, and I think he's going to peter out here. And again, one thing about this game, and look, it's so many years in the future. Think Wings of Liberty was 2010. We are way, way past 2010 if we think about like the internet age especially and how sort of time moves faster on the internet. We're like 14 years past when this game first came out. That's an eternity. And we've had 3 full expansions of getting to view it and like see what's good and what's bad. As Slasher's there. Funny story about Slasher at MLG Dallas. There was some goofy Halo ripoff game that they were demoing. When you go to these lands, especially back in the day, there were a lot of like upstart games that wanted to do demos and promos and stuff. And I had my squad of IRL buddies, but only 3 other guys with me there. And it was a 5v5, and we had Slasher himself, the big-nosed esports journalist, step in and do some reps with us. Slasher, despite his Counter-Strike and Quake pedigree, the guy had a Quake profile picture for like a decade, bottom fragged and never gave a single call out, completely worthless. Hilariously, he was sitting next to like my notoriously, I had a friend who likes to rage, as I'm sure many of you do. He was sitting next to like my friend who was raging as we got eliminated and like sort of slamming the table, and Slasher was getting like clearly uncomfortable near the end of the game when it was clear we were going to lose. Last is trying to punch in here as a beautiful counterattack occurs. Note how both of these games have been action-packed and back and forth, and Life was at legitimate risk of dying or almost dying throughout much of this game. Think about him losing those drones. Think about the fact that if Last had defended just a little better, Life would have basically had to GG. The game is very dynamic and exciting, and there's counterattack potential and back and forth. Think about how little of that there is in Legacy. His Mutas come out here, and there are no Thors. This is a total ground and pound army. Life desperately trying to save the third. It's 2-2 in a best of 5, and the third goes down, and that's brutal because the Terran has a third. But again, this is a very all-in-y style that sacrifices and delays a lot. So the eBay has been delayed. The player is very vulnerable to mutas, Last is. He's played a fast and loose style like Misha Barton. A LAN game is one where your nerves can get to you and your macro can slip a little bit. I would dare say if this was a ladder game or even a GSL game where Last had been before, he probably wouldn't have floated as much. His eBay might have been a little quicker. Maybe not, though. He might have waited until he saw mutas, but he maybe would have made a preemptive Thor. But as it stands, whenever you're being consistently pressured and counterattacked and messed with, it's going to mess up your micro. It's going to force you to make mistakes. And we can see mutas magic boxing over this Thor, the Thor vexingly being mass repaired, and this is really bad for Life. Even though he's up 30 supply, however, he is sitting there hitting the SCVs, and he has regained a worker killed advantage, which is sort of hilarious. And 23 workers here for the Terran. So good magic box micro there from Life as he cracked the natural open and did severe damage. And 4 Thors that out are going to chase the mutas away. That was a very weird exchange where because the eBay was delayed so long and there weren't any turrets, he relied on Thors, which of course with Marines decimate mutas. But the way that Life microed very intelligently forced the hand of the Thor player. And I didn't even really realize until casting this game that like, oh, he's doing that on purpose to just kill all the workers. I was almost thinking like, is he looking away at something else? No, like he wanted the Muta Glaives to just splash and kill all the workers, which was brilliant. Because now it's sort of like, okay, your natural's open, like my third is good, like I'm taking a fourth. Part of why Life is worth remembering was he was truly brilliant, not just in how he microed lings, which was the most special characteristic about him, but the thing about Life is he was decisive and he was not afraid to be cheesy, which is a characteristic that all the truly great Zergs have. Jaedong, okay, Savior, both of these guys were not afraid to just turn the aggression up to 11, cut drones completely and really go for it, okay? It's easier said than done, believe me, because a lot of times if you cut drones and go for it, you show up and you're like, okay, well this is never going to work. Life and Jaedong were the sort of players who would show up and make it work. Life doing this and playing this sort of style is way harder than it would be in Legacy because there's no Ravager, there's no Lurker. You have to get all the way up to Hive to get to Viper, which was more difficult at this time. Also, the maps were smaller. We're playing on Cloud Kingdom, which was like a mid Wings of Liberty map. This map had almost been played to death by this point. But this was a map that was considered bad for Zerg on some level, sort of a more small claustrophobic map. The maps at this time were way more dynamic and interesting, just like the scene in its entirety. And Last goes down there, Life, brilliantly completing the reverse sweep. Or not a reverse sweep, but just an exceptional best of 5 that goes down to that final game. The defining factor of that series was Life's Ling micro, his crisis management and counterattacking. If we think about Life's career, this was a guy who redefined how to use the Zergling. He was always there with a group of Lings at your third to run into your natural when you moved out. He was always there to harass and be a big pain whenever you wanted to do anything. He understood that if the Terran moves out, he's going to want to reinforce. If the Terran attacks me, he's going to want to do it off of a timing. He's going to have his door open. He's maybe going to want to take something behind it. Life would always backstab. His Lings were always in the right position. He was exceptionally talented. And I remember watching that game, the first game that we watched, game 4 of the series, where Last moved out with those blue flame Hellions and it was like, oh, he's dead. Like Life is just dead, and he held it. That was just incredible. Whenever we reflect upon the lands of yesteryear, I think it is very jarring and it is very telling and it is sort of sad to see like where the scene is in its current state. And that's nothing against any of the current players or commentators, but think about how many legends of the scene that were at this LAN, the last big LAN at Dallas before this, and the players that showed up now. A lot of these guys are not in the scene in any capacity. It's not like they just didn't show up to the tournament. So, like Life, Polt, Last plays Brood War, MC coaches League, MVP's been gone for years, Taja's a cop in Korea, Flash is not even playing Brood War and he's the best ever, Brett's been retired. So this was a Venomous Classic, and the most recent Dallas LAN that occurred reminded me of this one, and it reminded me of how special it was to get to go to these LANs back in the day. If you relate to it, comment and sub for more.